When he asked me to stay a little longer after everyone had left the office, I didn't think much of it. We'd had late meetings before, the kind that stretched into the evening when deadlines loomed. But this time felt different, his voice lower, his words slower, and something about the way he closed the door behind me made the air shift. I stood there, clutching the edge of my notebook, telling myself this was just another conversation about work. But then he smiled, not the professional smile I'd seen 100 times, but something else entirely, and I felt my heart stutter in my chest. My phone buzzed in my bag. I ignored it, too aware of the quiet in the room. He leaned against the desk, his gaze fixed on me like he was trying to read my thoughts. I laughed nervously at something he said, though I couldn't even recall the words moments later. My mind was already running ahead, flashing images I didn't want to see. That night I told myself nothing happened. I told myself I imagined the shift, the weight of his attention, the way my breath hitched for reasons I didn't want to admit. But 3 months later, I can't tell that story anymore. Because everything spiraled from that moment in ways I never saw coming. And if I'm going to tell you the truth, the full truth, you have to understand how it all began, and why I crossed lines I never thought I would. Before I reveal everything, write in the comments where you're watching from and answer this. Have you ever kept a secret so heavy that you felt it pressing on you every single day, waiting for the moment it would finally break you? I used to think my life was simple, and for years, that thought brought me comfort. Marriage had smoothed itself into routine, quiet dinners, small weekend rituals, the kind of habits that seemed safe, unshakable. It wasn't passion anymore, but it was stability. And stability, I told myself, was what I needed. But lately, that comfort had started to feel like a weight, pressing down in ways I couldn't name. My husband was a good man, a steady one. He never yelled, never made me doubt his loyalty. But somewhere along the way, we'd stopped really looking at each other. We shared a house, a bed, a life, but the spark that once drew us together had long since faded into background noise, like the hum of the refrigerator or the ticking clock in our kitchen. Work became my distraction, my escape. I'd taken the job as an event planner thinking it would be something to fill my time, but it became more than that. It became a place where I felt noticed again. In the office, people valued my ideas. They asked for my opinion. At home, I wasn't sure anyone did. That's why, when the new boss arrived, I noticed him immediately. He was younger, sharper, the kind of person who seemed to command a room without raising his voice. He had an energy that was hard to ignore, even when I told myself I should. The first time he called me into his office, it was about a cancelled project. I walked in expecting a quick discussion about budget cuts, maybe a few questions about logistics. But as he spoke, there was something in his tone that didn't quite match the words. He wasn't just talking about work, he was studying me, weighing something. I sat across from him, hands folded in my lap, too aware of the way his eyes lingered just a moment longer than they needed to. When I left that day, I told myself I was imagining things. I even laughed at myself in the car, shaking my head like I could just toss the thought out of the window. But later, at home, cooking dinner, I caught myself thinking about that conversation. About his smile, the way he leaned back in his chair, relaxed but deliberate. My husband walked in while I was stirring the sauce, asked about my day, and I told him it was fine. I didn't mention the way my heart had jumped for no reason when the boss said my name. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of my days changed subtly. I found myself choosing clothes more carefully in the mornings, not dramatic changes, just little things, a softer blouse, a necklace I hadn't worn in years. I told myself it was for me, that I just wanted to feel good again. But deep down, I knew there was another reason. I noticed when he noticed. He started stopping by my desk more often, asking about projects, sometimes about things that weren't projects at all. Casual questions, the kind you could easily dismiss as friendly, but the tone lingered. He'd leaned just slightly closer than necessary, his voice dropping, and I felt my breath catch in ways I hadn't in a long time. At home, nothing looked different from the outside. We still ate dinner together, still watched the same shows on the same worn-out couch. But inside, I felt restless, like I was carrying something I couldn't name. My husband didn't notice, not really. Or maybe he did, but chose not to see it. One night, as I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, I asked myself what I was doing. Why I was letting my thoughts drift the way they did. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just flattered, just enjoying the attention. But a part of me knew that wasn't the whole truth. The next morning, the boss sent an email asking me to stop by his office to go over some details about a new client. The words were harmless. Professional. But as I read them, my pulse quickened. I walked into his office later that day, notebook in hand, telling myself this was just another meeting. But the way he looked at me when I closed the door said otherwise. I didn't leave with anything I could name as wrong. Nothing happened, no lines crossed, no scandalous words exchanged. But I left with a knot in my stomach and a thought I couldn't shake. Maybe something was starting, and maybe I wasn't ready to stop it. That night, over dinner, my husband talked about a new project at work. I nodded at the right times, smiled when I was supposed to, but my mind wasn't there. It was still in that office, still replaying a look I couldn't forget. And as I rinsed the dishes afterward, the thought whispered again, louder this time, something has shifted, and you can't unfeel it. The next morning began like any other, but something in the way I got dressed felt different, even if I didn't want to admit it. I reached for a blouse I hadn't worn in months, one that felt softer against my skin, and paired it with a skirt that always made me feel quietly confident. It wasn't deliberate, at least not in the way I could name out loud, but I was aware of every choice. The necklace I clasped around my neck wasn't for my husband, who barely noticed those details anymore. I caught my own reflection in the mirror, paused for longer than I meant to, and wondered who I was dressing for. When I got to the parking lot at work, his car was already there. I told myself not to read into it. But as I stepped out of mine, he appeared, leaning against his door, phone in hand, the faintest smirk when he saw me. He offered to give me a ride to the office entrance since it was raining lightly, even though my car wasn't that far. His voice was casual, like it was nothing, but I felt my pulse in my throat. I said yes, sliding into the passenger seat, smelling the faint trace of his cologne in the confined space. The drive was short, but the silence in the car wasn't empty, it was thick, heavy, almost too much. I glanced at him, then away, focusing on the wipers moving across the glass. He asked about my evening, his tone unhurried, like he wasn't looking for details but for openings. I gave vague answers, short sentences. It was quiet, I said. We had dinner, watched TV. He nodded but didn't comment, and somehow that felt like he knew more than I'd said. Later that day, he asked me to stop by his office after lunch. There was no urgency in his words, but the way he phrased it, just swing by, I'd like to discuss a few things, made it feel personal. I told myself this was work, just work, and still, my hands felt a little clammy as I knocked on his door. He didn't sit behind his desk when I came in. Instead, he leaned against it, arms folded, his eyes holding mine longer than they should have. He started talking about the project we'd discussed before, about deadlines and possibilities, but the conversation drifted, slipping into softer questions. He asked how I felt about the changes in the company, about the workload. Then, almost seamlessly, he asked about me, how long I'd been married, how I found balance between work and home. I answered carefully, half-truths wrapped in polite smiles. I said things were fine, even as my voice betrayed the hesitation. He didn't push, but he didn't look away either, and that was worse somehow. I remember the way the room felt, how the air seemed closer, how the sounds from the hallway faded. He moved just a step closer, enough that I could see the subtle crease near his eyes when he smiled, and in that small, suspended moment, the space between us shifted. We didn't plan it. We didn't even speak. We just looked at each other too long, and then, almost like we were following some unspoken script, we closed the gap. The moment was fleeting, a heartbeat stretched into something longer. But when it ended, we both stepped back slightly, like we'd touched fire and were startled by the heat. I picked up my notebook from his desk with trembling fingers, feeling the paper bend under my grip. My breath was uneven, though I tried to hide it. He didn't say anything, just watched me as I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, forcing a smile that felt too thin. The walk back to my desk felt surreal. Everything around me, the ringing phones, the sound of typing, the chatter from the break room, felt exaggerated, like a film scene turned up too loud. I sat down, stared at my computer screen, but couldn't see the words. All I could feel was the imprint of what had just happened. By the time I left for the day, the sky had cleared, but I didn't notice until much later. I drove home, the steering wheel cool under my hands, my thoughts tumbling over each other. I replayed it, dissected it, tried to pin it down. Was it an accident? Was it just a mistake? Or was it the start of something I couldn't stop? When I walked through the front door, the house smelled like dinner. My husband was already home, setting plates on the table. He asked about my day in the same voice he always used, the kind that expected the same answer. I told him it was busy, and he nodded, moving on. We sat at the table, talking about groceries, about the leaking faucet, about the kind of things that fill a life but leave no space for much else. But under the surface, I could feel the shift. The kiss, just one, just that, sat between every word I spoke. I found myself looking at him across the table, wondering if he could sense it. Wondering if some instinct told him that something had happened, even if he didn't have the words for it yet. That night, I stood in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, and stared at my own reflection. I saw the same face, the same lines, the same tired eyes. But something in them was different, something small, almost invisible, but real. I thought about what I'd done, what it meant, and whether it meant anything at all. I told myself it was nothing, that it could stop here, that no one had to know. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. The following days moved in an uneven rhythm, the kind that made me question what had really changed and what I was simply imagining. From the outside, everything looked the same drive to work, the same meetings, the same faces passing in the hallways, but I felt a quiet current running under every moment. Every time I saw him across the office, my breath betrayed me for a second. I would look down at my papers, pretend to shuffle something, but inside, I felt the pull of the memory that refused to leave. I told myself over and over that it was nothing. That one brief moment in his office meant less than I was making it. I could stop thinking about it if I really wanted to. I convinced myself that what had happened was an accident, an impulse that didn't need to lead anywhere. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't the truth. Because the thought of him didn't fade the way harmless moments usually do, it stayed, replayed, sharpened in my mind instead of dulling. At work, the atmosphere felt almost painfully normal. He didn't call me into his office again right away, and that made it worse somehow. It made me wonder if he was waiting for me to say something, or if he regretted everything. When I passed by his office door and saw him talking to someone else, smiling that same smile, I felt an unexpected jolt of jealousy, one I hated myself for. Colleagues started making little comments I couldn't quite ignore. Harmless jokes about who was staying late, or how the new boss had his favorites. Their words weren't sharp, but they landed anyway, lodging in my mind. I laughed when they said them, pretending not to care, but on the inside, I was tense, scanning every sentence for what they might really mean. At home, the difference in me was subtle, but it was there. My husband didn't ask many questions, but he noticed things in his quiet way. He noticed that I was more distracted at dinner, that I was checking my phone without reason. He didn't accuse, didn't press, he just watched, and his silence was heavier than any question he could have asked. The boss finally sent another email, this time about discussing a possible way to revive the cancelled project. The message was written in the same professional tone as all the others, but I felt the weight of it as soon as I read it. The way he phrased "it might be better to talk somewhere we won't be interrupted" made my chest tighten. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, reading those lines again and again. It wasn't overt, it wasn't inappropriate, it could all be explained if anyone ever saw it. But I knew what it meant, and more importantly, I knew what it meant to me. When I agreed to meet, I told myself it was because of work, because I owed it to the company to try and save the project. But I didn't tell anyone where or when. I didn't tell my husband why I would be late that evening. The hours leading up to it felt strange, stretched. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind wandered constantly. I imagined the conversation, imagined the look on his face when I arrived, imagined the moment we might both pretend was only about work until it wasn't. When the time came, I left the office telling a colleague I had errands to run. I felt my own voice too bright, my smile too quick. On the drive, I kept rehearsing what I would say if anyone asked where I'd been, even though no one was asking. The restaurant he chose wasn't loud or crowded, it was discreet, understated, the kind of place where two people could talk for hours without drawing attention. I told myself that meant nothing, but even that was a lie. He was already there when I arrived, standing as I approached the table, his jacket draped neatly over the back of the chair. He smiled in that way he had, the calm, deliberate, the kind that made me forget what I'd planned to say. We started with talk about the project, about numbers and schedules and ideas. But the conversation drifted, just like it had in his office. He asked about things that weren't on the agenda, about my past jobs, about how I'd ended up here, about what I wanted out of the future. I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone in years, not secrets, exactly, but pieces of myself I thought I'd stopped sharing. I didn't know why I was so open, except that he listened in a way that made me want to keep speaking. At one point, his hand brushed against mine when he reached for his glass. The contact was small, accidental, but it felt electric, and I hated how much I noticed. When I stepped outside afterward, the air felt sharper, cooler. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the night, and realized I didn't want to leave. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. He came out a minute later, offering to walk me to my car. It was the kind of gesture that seemed polite, but the space between us felt too loaded. On the drive home, I kept seeing his face in my mind, kept hearing the way he'd said certain things, not the words themselves, but the pauses around them. When I walked into the house, the lights were on, dinner dishes already in the sink. My husband asked if everything had gone well, and I said yes, keeping my voice steady. But later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to comfort me. Now it only made the thoughts louder. I turned on my side, closing my eyes, but the restaurant, the table, the look on his face, they didn't fade. They stayed just as clear, reminding me of something I didn't want to name yet but couldn't ignore. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake, like something unnamed had followed me home and settled in the corner of the room. I stood in front of the wardrobe longer than usual, staring at rows of clothes that all felt suddenly too loud or too quiet. I ended up choosing something simple, something I told myself was neutral. But even then, I felt his eyes in my mind, as if he would notice the smallest choice. The drive to work was slower than usual, traffic thicker, but it wasn't the cars that made me grip the steering wheel harder, it was the way my own thoughts twisted, looping back to that dinner, to the things we'd said, and more to the things we hadn't. I tried to catalog it all, to sort what had been harmless from what had been too much. But the line blurred the more I thought about it. At the office, nothing looked different. The same hum of printers, the same clipped voices on phones, the same faint smell of coffee that had been sitting too long. And yet I felt every look, every passing glance from colleagues. It was paranoia, maybe, but I caught myself wondering if they could see it, if they could see what was running under my skin. When he passed my desk that morning, he didn't stop, just nodded in my direction like he would to anyone. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made me feel the quiet between us more acutely. It was as if we were both pretending nothing had shifted, while every nerve in me screamed that something had. Later that afternoon, he appeared by my desk again, asking in that calm, deliberate way if I had time to go over a few final notes from the project meeting. His tone was light, his expression unreadable, but the question felt heavy all the same. I agreed, even though my work was already stacked high. I told myself there was no reason to say no, that there was nothing in the request anyone could question. But as I followed him to his office, my pulse betrayed me, each beat louder than the one before. Inside, he closed the door with the same quiet ease he always had. He stayed standing this time, leaning slightly against the corner of his desk, his arms crossed but his posture open. He talked about the project again, about small details and scheduling issues, but his words were just scaffolding for something else, something unspoken. I noticed things I shouldn't have, the way his shirt sleeve was rolled, the faint trace of cologne, the way his gaze lingered half a second too long. They were small things, insignificant on their own, but together they built a tension that filled the room. We didn't talk about the dinner directly, but it was there, hovering in every pause. When he mentioned the project maybe needing another discussion off-site, I felt the breath catch in my throat before I could stop it. The meeting ended without any clear resolution, but I left feeling more tangled than when I arrived. I returned to my desk, stared at the emails piling up, but couldn't focus. My fingers moved across the keyboard automatically, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, circling the same unanswerable questions. That evening, I was supposed to meet a friend for coffee. I canceled, claiming exhaustion, though that wasn't quite the truth. The idea of sitting across from someone who might ask casual questions about my life felt unbearable. I couldn't lie convincingly enough, not when my head was this full. At home, dinner was quiet. My husband asked how my day had been, and I gave the same safe answer, busy. He nodded, chewing thoughtfully, his eyes skimming over me like they always had. But for the first time, I wondered if he noticed more than he let on. After dinner, he sat in the living room with the TV on, while I stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes, the warm water running over my hands without me feeling it. My reflection in the window above the sink looked almost like a stranger, same face, same hair, but the eyes were searching for something I couldn't name. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily one small decision seemed to lead to another. How one moment in an office could become dinner, how dinner could become a conversation that felt like it belonged somewhere else entirely. The next day was more of the same weight, the same quiet observations, the same careful choreography of pretending. But by midweek, something shifted. He sent another message, brief and neutral on the surface, suggesting we touch base at a restaurant near the office to finalize the numbers for the client presentation. I stared at that email longer than I should have. The words gave me an excuse to say yes, and I took it, even while part of me whispered that I shouldn't. The restaurant was smaller than the last, quieter, tucked away on a side street I rarely visited. When I arrived, he was already seated, his jacket folded neatly over the chair again, like before. We talked about the presentation first, because that's what we were supposed to do. But before long, we slipped into other things, the same way we always did. He asked about my college years, about what I had wanted back then. I surprised myself by answering honestly, by admitting dreams I hadn't said out loud in years. At one point, His hand brushed mine again, a simple accidental thing. But the spark of it jolted through me anyway, leaving me unsettled. When I left, the night air felt sharper again, but this time, I didn't just pause, I lingered. I stood there longer than necessary, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing on me. On the drive home, the silence in the car was thick. I gripped the wheel tightly, watching the road ahead, but all I could see was his face across that table, the way he listened, the way he didn't look away. When I got home, the house smelled faintly of dinner again. My husband looked up from the couch when I came in, asked if the meeting had gone well. I said yes, and he nodded, turning back to the TV. But later, as I stood in the bathroom again, toothbrush in hand, staring at myself in the mirror, I felt that familiar twist in my chest. Because I knew, even if I didn't say it out loud, that something inside me was shifting. And once that shift had started, I wasn't sure it could be undone. The week dragged on, heavy with the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself but seeps into every corner of your life. At home, I went through the motions, making dinner, folding laundry, asking the same safe questions about my husband's day. But my mind was elsewhere, looping over things I didn't want to admit even to myself. I told myself it was only distraction, that I was just tired, that nothing irreversible had happened yet. But the more I repeated those reassurances, the hollower they sounded. In the office, the rhythm of our interactions shifted again. He didn't hover, didn't make obvious overtures, but there was an undercurrent in everything. He would pause by my desk, ask about details of a project, and then linger a second longer than needed. His words were all appropriate, his tone professional, but the space between those moments was charged. It was like standing near a live wire, you didn't have to touch it to feel the hum. I found myself rearranging my day around his. Little things, small choices, what time to grab coffee, when to walk down certain hallways, how long to take on a report, became opportunities for proximity. I hated admitting that, even silently, but it was true. There was an unspoken pattern forming between us, one that nobody else seemed to notice, but I felt it in every breath. One afternoon, he appeared at my desk again. This time he didn't talk about schedules or budgets. He asked if I had a few minutes to check something over in his office. It was an ordinary request, nothing anyone would think twice about, but my chest tightened all the same. I nodded, keeping my voice steady, even though my hand shook slightly when I picked up my notebook. Inside his office, the door clicked softly behind me. He wasn't behind the desk, he was standing by the window, sunlight cutting across his shoulders. He turned, and there was that same pause, the one that always seemed to stretch just a fraction too long. He spoke about a few minor details first, things that barely mattered, but it was clear that wasn't why I was there. The conversation slid, the way it always did, away from charts and deadlines and into something quieter. He asked how I'd been sleeping, if I'd been stressed with the workload. The questions were casual enough, but they didn't feel casual. I answered carefully, words measured, but my pulse was louder than my voice. And then there was that moment again, the one that seemed inevitable the second it arrived. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even deliberate. It happened in the space between one breath and the next, as if both of us moved at the same time without deciding to. The kiss was brief, but the weight of it wasn't. When I stepped back, I could feel the heat in my face, the tremor in my hands. I grabbed my notebook like a shield, muttered something about needing to get back to my desk. He didn't stop me. He didn't even say much. He just looked at me in a way that said everything. Back at my desk, my mind felt split in two, one part struggling to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me, the other replaying that moment in an endless loop. I stared at numbers, typed without meaning to, deleted mistakes I barely noticed making. Every time my phone buzzed with an email, I flinched, half expecting it to be from him, though it rarely was. Leaving the office that day felt surreal, like stepping out of one life and into another. The evening air felt too cool, the drive too long. I told myself I could stop this, if I wanted to, I could stop. But I didn't pull that thought apart, didn't examine why it felt like a lie. At home, the house was warm and quiet, as always. My husband greeted me with his usual easy calm, asking about my day in the same voice he always used. I said the word busy, like I had 100 times before, and he nodded, accepting it. We sat across from each other at dinner, the clatter of cutlery the only sound for a while. He mentioned a leak in the upstairs sink, a neighbor's new fence, the kind of small talk that once felt like safety. But now, every word seemed to skim the surface of something deeper I didn't want him to reach. Later that night, when the house was dark and he was already asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I could still feel it, the press of the kiss, the heat in my face, the undeniable pull. I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman who believed in clear lines, in rules you didn't cross. That woman felt distant now, like a stranger I used to know. I told myself again that I could stop this, that it wasn't too late. But the truth was, even in the stillness of the dark, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The following morning, the weight of what had happened in his office lingered over me like an invisible fog. I moved through the motions of the day, but nothing felt natural anymore. Even the way I poured coffee felt deliberate, as if I was afraid someone would see too much in the smallest gesture. The kiss the day before was brief, but its presence hadn't faded. It sat at the back of my mind, undeniable and sharp. At home, I didn't speak of it, of course. I came downstairs in the same robe I always wore, prepared breakfast in the same quiet way. My husband read the news on his phone, occasionally mentioning headlines without looking up. His voice was casual, familiar, but I heard something different in it now, maybe because I was listening differently. On the drive to work, I tried to imagine the day ahead as if it were a normal one. I pictured emails, calls, routine tasks. But there was a gnawing awareness that nothing between us, me and him, was routine anymore. The last few days had made sure of that. At the office, he didn't come to my desk right away. Hours passed before I saw him, and that absence became its own kind of tension. I caught myself glancing toward his door, waiting for it to open, frustrated by how much space he took up in my thoughts. I had always prided myself on control, on boundaries, on professionalism. Now it felt like those things were slipping, inch by inch, and I wasn't sure how to stop them. When he finally appeared, it was almost casual, almost. He paused by my desk with a document in hand, asking about a meeting later in the week. But his eyes lingered, that same unspoken pull beneath the surface of his words. I answered simply, acting as if my heart hadn't just started beating faster. By midday, the office was buzzing with news. A conference in another city had been confirmed. Our team would need to attend. The idea of it landed heavy in my chest, though I couldn't let that show. Conferences meant travel. Travel meant distance from everything familiar. And in this case, it also meant proximity to him that wouldn't be contained by the walls of an office. I stared at the itinerary when it arrived in my inbox, the dates marked out neatly, the hotel listed. I told myself it was just another part of the job, that I'd attended conferences before, that this was nothing new. But even as I thought it, I felt the quiet thrum of nerves under my skin. That night at home, I told my husband about the trip, mentioning it over dinner like it was an afterthought. He nodded, accepting the explanation without much comment. "It'll be busy, I guess," he said, and I agreed. The silence that followed felt thick, and I wondered if he sensed something underneath, even if he didn't know what. The days before the trip passed slowly. The office was full of talk about schedules, presentations, logistics. But beneath that, I felt something else, the growing awareness of what this trip could become. I caught his eye in meetings, brief glances that meant nothing to anyone else but felt loaded to me. On the day we left, I packed carefully. Too carefully. I folded clothes that looked professional, but each choice carried weight. I picked a jacket that made me feel confident, a scarf I rarely wore, small things that felt deliberate even if I didn't say so. The train ride to the city was long enough to feel like its own world. I sat by the window, watching the scenery blur past, trying to ground myself in the motion. He sat a few rows away, absorbed in his laptop, but I was aware of him the entire time. At the hotel, the group dispersed to their rooms. I wheeled my suitcase down a carpeted hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning products and something floral. My room was ordinary, beige walls, neatly folded towels, a desk by the window, but stepping into it felt like crossing a threshold. The evening was supposed to be uneventful, a quiet dinner, reviewing notes for the next day. That's what I told myself, that's what I told my husband over the phone when he called to check in. His voice was steady, familiar, grounding. But after we hung up, the silence in the room felt almost too still. Later, there was a knock at the door. Just 3 soft taps, unassuming, but they made my breath catch anyway. I hesitated before opening it, but not for long. He stood there, not in a suit but in a simple shirt, holding a folder that looked like an excuse. He mentioned needing to go over some details for tomorrow's presentation, his voice level, his eyes steady. I stepped aside to let him in. The conversation began the way all our conversations did, safe, structured, all about work. We sat at the desk, flipping through pages, pointing at lines of text. But the space between the words, the pauses between sentences, told another story. There was no kiss this time. No sudden move. But the air in that room felt dense, thick with everything we weren't saying. When he finally left, the room felt both emptier and heavier. I sat on the edge of the bed afterward, staring at my suitcase, at the folder on the desk, at the space where he'd been standing. I told myself that nothing had happened, not really. That tomorrow would be about work, about the conference, about what we were here to do. But somewhere inside, I already knew that the trip would change everything. The conference unfolded in a blur of meetings, presentations, and polite conversations. The hotel lobby buzzed with people from different companies, all dressed in suits and carrying briefcases, their voices blending into a constant hum of professionalism. The days were packed, the schedules tight, leaving little room for anything outside the work at hand. But beneath the surface of the busy days, something was changing. The space between me and him was shrinking, not through grand gestures but through small moments, shared glances, quick smiles, the way he offered to carry a stack of papers or hold the door. These little things built a tension that pulsed quietly under the surface of everything else. The evenings were different. After long hours, most attendees retired early or gathered in groups for drinks and networking. I found myself retreating to my room earlier than usual, citing exhaustion, though I felt a mix of relief and apprehension in the solitude. One evening, he invited me to review some reports in his room, citing last-minute changes that needed to be addressed before the next day. The invitation was professional, yet the tone carried an unmistakable undercurrent. I hesitated but accepted. The hotel room was modest, neutral tones, a desk near the window, a bed pushed against one wall. The space felt smaller than his office back home, more intimate despite the lack of decoration. He closed the door behind us with a soft click that echoed louder than expected in the quiet room. We spread the documents across the desk, the rustle of paper the only sound as we worked through the numbers and notes. Our voices were low, careful, but the silence between our words was heavy. At one point, I glanced up and caught him watching me. The look in his eyes was hard to define, calm, intense, maybe something else. I felt my throat dry, my heart quicken. Then there was a knock on the door. It startled me, though it was just a staff member delivering more supplies for the conference. He opened the door briefly, exchanged a few words, then left, leaving the room even quieter than before. After the door closed, the air shifted. The professional barrier we'd maintained thinned, and for a moment, the tension was tangible. I felt the weight of every glance, every unspoken thought hanging between us. I told myself to focus on the work, to keep things professional, but my body betrayed me with every small shiver, every quickened breath. Hours later, we finally set the papers aside. I packed my things quietly, avoiding his gaze for a moment before looking up. He smiled, a brief, almost shy smile that felt out of place given the situation. When I turned to leave, the door didn't close immediately behind me. Instead, I heard the soft sound of it remaining slightly ajar. I paused in the hallway, the quiet stretching out, and I realized then that this trip was no longer about business. Later, in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, the day's events replaying in my mind. I felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear, the pull of something new tangled with the weight of what I left behind. The next morning, as I prepared to leave the hotel, I dressed with more care than before. I chose a blouse that felt both professional and personal, paired with a skirt that reminded me of a time when I felt more certain of myself. As I packed my suitcase, I thought about the road ahead, about the choices I'd made, and the ones still to come. The conference was ending, but for me, the journey was just beginning. The train ride home felt longer than the one that had brought us there. Maybe it was because the conference was over, or maybe it was because my mind wouldn't stop circling the events of the past few nights, dragging me into the weight of what I didn't want to name yet. The chatter of other passengers faded into background noise. I barely registered the announcements over the speaker. I stared out the window, the scenery sliding past in blurred streaks, and wondered how something as ordinary as a work trip could feel like such a fault line in my life. When I walked into my house later that evening, everything looked the same, my husband's shoes by the door, the familiar smell of dinner simmering on the stove, but it didn't feel the same. It felt like I had stepped back into a world that was mine, yet not entirely. He greeted me with the same warmth, his voice steady and familiar. "Long trip?" he asked. I nodded, my throat dry, and muttered something about being tired. We sat down to dinner like we always did. He talked about the neighbors, about a delivery mix-up, about the small inconveniences that make up a normal week. I smiled when appropriate, nodded in the right places, but my mind was fractured. Part of me was present, part of me was still in that hotel room, still feeling the shadow of what had happened, or hadn't happened, but almost had. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my husband's even breathing beside me. Normally that sound lulled me into sleep. That night it kept me awake. I turned over and tried to force myself to think about something else, anything else, but my mind wouldn't cooperate. It kept dragging me back to those days away, to the subtle shifts, to the choices I'd made without even realizing I'd made them. The next few days at work only made things harder. The office buzzed with post-conference follow-ups, calls, emails, planning sessions, but underneath all of it, there was the quiet tension between us. He didn't treat me differently in any obvious way, if anything, he was careful not to. But every time our eyes met in a meeting, every time he paused by my desk just long enough to hand me a file, the air seemed to thicken. Colleagues noticed something, though they didn't know what. Their comments were small, but sharp enough to stick. A coworker teased about how the trip must have been productive with a knowing smile. Another joked about who spent the most time with the boss. I laughed them off, but each word lodged itself somewhere under my skin. At home, the tension followed me. My husband didn't accuse or question me, but his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, like he was trying to read something unsaid. He'd ask if I was tired, if work was too much, if I needed a break. I'd brush it off, offering simple reassurances, but his silence afterward said more than his words. One evening, I found myself in the bathroom staring at my reflection. The woman in the mirror looked the same hair, same lines around the eyes, same faint smudge of lipstick worn from the day, but I didn't feel the same. I searched my own face for answers, for some sign of what I was becoming, and found only the quiet question, how did it get this far? Back in the office, rumors began to circulate more openly. Nothing concrete, just whispers, but I felt the shift. Someone mentioned they'd seen us leave a meeting together a little late. Another coworker joked about the lucky few who always seemed to get the boss's attention. The comments stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I found myself avoiding certain rooms, certain conversations, but avoidance only fed the speculation. One afternoon, he called me into his office again. His tone was calm, professional, but when the door clicked shut behind me, the quiet returned, the same charged silence I'd felt before. He spoke about work, about strategy, about a client who needed attention, but his voice was softer than it had to be. I listened, nodded, took notes, but my chest felt tight. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the weight of what was hanging between us, but the words didn't come. When I left his office, I felt eyes on me. I didn't look around to see whose they were. That evening, I drove home slower than usual, taking streets I didn't need to take. I parked in front of the house and sat there for a moment, staring at the light in the kitchen window, feeling the divide between the two lives pressing in on me. Inside, my husband was in the living room, his voice warm as he asked how my day had been. I smiled, said busy, like I always did, and wondered if he could hear the crack in that single word. Later, as I folded laundry, I thought about how ordinary everything looked, shirts stacked neatly, socks paired, the quiet hum of the dryer. And yet nothing inside me felt ordinary anymore. It was then, standing in that laundry room, that the thought hit me with an uncomfortable clarity, this wasn't a distraction anymore. It wasn't just a moment or two that could be brushed off. Something had shifted for good. And whatever happened next would not stay hidden forever. The week after the conference felt heavier than any before. It wasn't just the work piled on my desk or the long hours, it was the quiet shift I couldn't undo, the weight of choices that had started out small and now felt impossible to carry. The office walls seemed closer, the air thicker, every sound sharper than it should have been. Even the hum of the copier or the faint ringing of someone's phone felt intrusive, like reminders that the world was moving forward while I stayed trapped in the same loop of thoughts. The whispers hadn't stopped, they had only gotten louder. They were never direct, never confrontational, but they were there. Two coworkers laughing quietly in the break room as I walked in, voices dropping the second they saw me. A lingering glance from someone who used to greet me casually but now seemed to be searching for something in my face. It wasn't just paranoia, I could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted. I told myself to ignore it, to focus on work, to hold myself with the same professionalism I always had. But every time I passed someone in the hallway and felt their eyes on me, my heart raced. Every time someone's tone held just a hint of knowing amusement, my palms went damp. And then there was him. He didn't change how he treated me, not in ways anyone could point to. His words were measured, his tone even, his actions unremarkable on the surface. But between us, there was a silence that spoke louder than anything else. One afternoon, he called me into his office. The blinds were half closed, the light filtered, softer than usual. He stood by the desk, papers in his hands, talking about quarterly numbers and client meetings. But it was clear that wasn't the reason he'd asked me in. There was a distance in his voice I hadn't heard before, a coolness beneath the calm. He didn't meet my eyes right away, and when he finally did, there was something guarded there. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but it was a shift, a reminder that I didn't really know all of him, not the parts he kept buried. I stood there, notebook in hand, the words he was saying barely registering. My mind was a tangle of questions. Had he heard the rumors too? Was he worried? Regretful? Or had something changed in him that I hadn't expected? When the meeting ended, I left the room feeling more unsteady than when I'd walked in. I could still feel his gaze on me as the door closed, but it wasn't the same gaze that had once pulled me in. That evening, as I drove home, the streets felt endless. I parked in front of the house and sat there for a moment, staring at the front door, unable to move. The lights were on inside, the same warm glow spilling across the driveway. But it felt like walking into another version of my life, one I no longer fully recognized. Inside, my husband was already at the table, sorting through the mail. He looked up and smiled, the same smile he always gave me, but this time I noticed the way it lingered just a moment too long, the slight furrow of his brow like he was searching my face for answers I couldn't give. We ate dinner quietly. He talked about a repair he needed to schedule for the car, about his day at work, about ordinary things. I nodded, responded when needed, but my mind was elsewhere. After dinner, I stood in the kitchen rinsing plates, the warm water running over my hands, and thought about the pieces of my life and how they no longer seemed to fit together. The steady marriage, the quiet house, the structured job, all of it felt like a puzzle that had been shaken, pieces scattered. The next morning, something cracked. I overheard two coworkers talking in the hallway as I passed, their voices low but not low enough. They stopped when they saw me, too suddenly to be innocent. Back at my desk, I tried to focus, but my hands shook slightly as I typed. I couldn't tell if it was anger, shame, or fear that made them tremble, or all three at once. Later, I found out something that changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic reveal, it was a slip in conversation, something I wasn't supposed to hear. A colleague mentioned his name, his past, and then stopped abruptly when they saw me standing there. But in that half-sentence, in that hesitation, something spilled through. I pieced it together in fragments. Old stories. Women before me. Situations that sounded eerily familiar, if not identical. The realization was like cold water. Everything I'd told myself about being different, about this being something singular, crumbled. I wasn't the exception, I was another line in a pattern, another version of a story that had been told before. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the dim entryway, my bag still over my shoulder, and let the weight of it all press down. My husband called from the other room, his voice warm and steady, unaware of the storm inside me. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just tangled in something complicated, I was standing at the edge of something I might not be able to come back from. The morning after I pieced together the truth felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes after a storm but before you see the damage. The air in the house was still, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, but I hadn't made it yet. I sat at the table staring at the empty mug in front of me, hands folded around nothing, feeling the weight of a decision pressing down. On the surface, everything looked the same. My husband came downstairs, greeted me with the same warm good morning he always used. He poured his own coffee, scanned the headlines on his phone, and asked if I'd be home late. His voice was as steady as it had always been, but I heard the hesitation beneath it, a flicker of something unsaid. I told him I wasn't sure. My voice sounded almost normal to my own ears, but there was a tightness to it I couldn't hide. He didn't press. He just nodded, like he always did. The drive to work felt endless, though it was the same route I'd driven 1,000 times. I watched the familiar streets pass by, coffee shops, gas stations, the same faded billboard near the highway exit, and felt like I was seeing them from a distance, as though I didn't quite belong to any of it anymore. When I walked into the office, the weight of the whispers was immediate. Conversations cut off too quickly, eyes flicked away too fast. The quiet had a texture to it now, it wasn't just silence, it was judgment. I moved through the day methodically, clinging to tasks like a lifeline. I answered emails, made calls, attended meetings, all with the same measured tone. But every movement felt like acting, like I was playing the part of someone I used to be. By midday, I couldn't avoid it anymore. He called me into his office. The blinds were drawn halfway, softening the light. He sat behind the desk this time, his posture straighter than usual, his face calm but unreadable. There was no warmth in his smile, not coldness, exactly, but distance. He spoke about work first, about schedules and budgets, about an upcoming deadline. The words were all professional, but they sounded hollow, like scaffolding for something else. Finally, the silence stretched, and I realized he wasn't going to say what I thought he might. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what I had learned or how I might feel about it. Something inside me hardened. I stood there, notebook in hand, and looked at him, not the version I had imagined, not the one I'd built in my head, but the man sitting behind that desk, calm and steady, as though nothing had happened. And I understood, in that moment, that I wasn't different. I wasn't the exception. When I left his office, my steps were slower, but they felt steadier. I closed the door behind me and didn't look back. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small tasks and unfinished thoughts. Colleagues still whispered, but the sound barely reached me now. I had stopped listening. That evening, I drove home without detours. I parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment staring at the front door. Inside, the house felt warm, familiar, solid. My husband greeted me like he always did, his voice soft, his eyes searching mine for something. We ate dinner quietly, and for once, I didn't try to fill the silence with rehearsed words. Afterward, I stood at the sink washing dishes, my hands in the warm water, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. I thought about the woman I'd been months ago, the one who believed her life was simple. I thought about the choices I'd made, the small ones, the quiet ones, that had carried me here. And I understood something important. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could choose what came next. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and walked into the living room where my husband sat, the familiar shape of him steady and certain in the dim glow of the lamp. I didn't know all the answers yet. I didn't know exactly how to explain everything, or even if I could. But for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight in my chest start to shift, not gone, not yet, but lighter. Because the story I'd been trapped in was over. And what came next would be mine to write.